So my name is Cristina Pato, and I'm a little bit of an in-betweener. I am a Galician bagpiper, classical pianist, a writer, an educator, a producer, and somehow when I think about what I do is connected to my own journey as an immigrant too. I come from Galicia. My parents were Galician immigrants to Venezuela, and then they came back to Galicia. So as an immigrant, I moved to the US in 2005, and I didn't come with the idea to stay here. I came with the idea of just getting my degree and go back to Spain. But then I met Yo-Yo Ma, the musician and humanist that changed my life, and that made me understand that being in between musical worlds, because as a Galician bagpiper, I've grown up like doing traditional music in the streets of Galicia, and then pop, and then rock, and then a little bit of everything. And as a classical pianist, I went through the typical path of classical musicians, like conservatory training, and then to the US when I was doing my doctoral degree, which was also in classical music. So what I think is powerful in terms of the way I've learned to understand that talent is somehow a responsibility is that somehow this being in between became my way of understanding my role in academic settings or even like in performing arts. So as a musician, I live in between many musical languages and realities. As an immigrant, I live in between two big communities and very different from each other, like Galicia and New York City. And as a teacher, I live in between disciplines because I somehow borrowed that idea of the power of being in between and I took it to the academic world that I started to work probably like 10 years ago. But music especially helps us talk about conversations that somehow are difficult sometimes to express with words. And when you are trying to connect the dots between different topics or different disciplines, music kind of proved to be a wonderful tool to be able to at least start that conversation from a different perspective. I serve as the King Juan Carlos Chair of Spanish Culture and Civilization in the year 2019, and I extended it a little bit to the year 2020 because I've decided to do the public lectures in one semester and the class in the other semester. And I did that because I live in New York, and I actually live like 7 minutes away by foot from the center. So it was the first time in my professional life that I actually walked to my job as opposed to like taking a plane or a train or a bus or another taxi. And that was a revelatory experience for myself to understand that you can actually do the things that you've been doing somewhere else for a long time, right in your neighborhood and right in your community. And that was very meaningful to me. When I started at NYU, it was because Professor James D. Fernandez invited me, or at least he was the first person that kind of told me that there was this possibility. This is very important on a personal level because his personal research on invisible immigrants from Spain to the US during the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was a project that I've been following up for a number of years because it connects to my own personal history, but also it connects to the reality of what it means to be a bagpiper, a Galician bagpiper, what it means to play an instrument that represents a particular community, and also an instrument that somehow became the voice and the sound of Galician immigrants all around the world. So when I started learning about Professor Fernandez's project, somehow I connected to it in a very meaningful and emotional way, and it made me reframe the question from the other side, because his project is about bringing visibility to a particular kind of immigrant that came to the US in a particular moment in history. And I remember some of the conversations we had before I came in as the chair at the Queen Juan Carlos Center were connected to the idea of, well, that might have been invisible to you, but as a Galician who is connected to Galician emigrants and immigrants, that's pretty much our everyday reality. I started using that question as a way, again, to connect the dots between the different disciplines I ended up working over the years, using this idea of invisibility, of like what is totally visible for me, may be completely invisible for you, and what is your everyday reality may be something that I have no idea that even exists. As a person that lives in between performing arts and academia, what I'm trying to do with the way I'm doing it is helping to redefine the role of artists in academia. What is it that we can do that a person that is in a specific discipline all the time may not be able to do because of lack of time or because of the particular settings of that particular department. Somehow artists, we have the ability of living in between because we are constantly borrowing and aware of the things that we have around us, and we try to use them as a way to create meaningful work, right? And in academic settings, especially in the last 10 years, like from 2010, 11 to today, I've learned that particular feeling of not fitting in was actually a very powerful one and a very useful one in academia. So in all the institutions that I've served as an artist in residence or as a visiting professor or as a person that develops a particular project for a number of years, you come with a vague idea in mind, you listen to the space that you are working in, and then you try to create something that is meaningful to the space, in this case academia or a particular department, and it's also meaningful to you. And you have to create the tools because you are creating something from scratch, so you have to first learn what are the things that you need to be able to put that in place, and then find the team that will help you to create and put that in place, and then source the audience that will be able to understand this different way of looking at the arts in academia that is not specific in the arts department or in the music department or in the cultural studies or whatever. It's more like, let's do something in the neuroscience building, or let's do something in the anthropology building. So what is it that we can do? And before I came to NYU, most of the time as a producer, I am the person that has to put all those things together. It's part of the contract too, right? Like that's the ability of most of, at least in my experience, the ability that we have as an artist is that we can make things happen. So I took that as my power too, and it was fascinating to come to the King Juan Carlos Center because that system is in place already. So if you come with an idea, it happens. And I wasn't used to work that way. Like usually I have to make it happen from the bottom up. And in the case of the King Juan Carlos, it's quite a luxury because you have a team that is in place that knows their audience, knows their space, and if you have a question, they know who is the person that you have to address that question to. And then, you know, having a team led by Laura Turegano is like a luxury that I already missed. I missed that luxury in the moment I realized that, you know, this is just 1 year. When I was at the center, first I thought that I could be more useful since I lived like right there, dividing my time at the center in 2 semesters. So in the first semester I could focus just on the public lectures, and on the second semester I could focus fully on my class on Invisible Music of Northern Spain class that I created for NYU. As a teacher, that was very important because my classes actually take a lot, well, like everybody's classes, but in my personal case, every class is like a lecture. So I take pride in considering that like a full-time job for the whole semester for me. So During the first semester, the fall of 2019, I borrowed some of the topics that I explored in other institutions like the University of California in Santa Barbara, where I am still serving as a visiting professor for the Unhold Teaching and Learning Initiative, in which I put together a number of faculty members from the neuroscience department, sociology, geography, anthropology, and public arts to create a class on memory and cultural memory loss. And somehow the topic of invisibility gave me a wonderful tool to look at the same problems or ideas or projects that I've been working in the past from a completely different perspective. So along with the King Juan Carlos Center team, I've put together 4 lectures in the fall semester. The first one was a way of trying to introduce myself not as a musician, not as a teacher, not as a producer or as a writer, but as a person that tries to follow her passions with the disciplines or with the tools that I have around me. And that also is connected to the idea of sustainability. Like as a bagpiper in Galicia, you are kind of part of the majority, and they may need you or you may need them, but there is always something to do for a bagpiper in Galicia. But when you leave Galicia, you have to find what is it that you do that is meaningful or could bring something else to another community, because I mean, I joke about this with my students, but it's not that much of a joke, because who needs a bagpiper, right? Like, as a performing artist, performing arts centers, they don't know where to place you, because I don't do traditional music, I don't do world music, I do whatever I feel like doing this year, and that somehow, the fact that I don't belong to any specific tag makes me feel like I don't fit in. And with that feeling of not fitting in comes, going back to the idea of what it means to be in between, comes this survival instinct and this sustainable instinct that even if I don't fit in, if I feel that what I am doing is what I want to be doing right now, then I use that as a way of making the space for my voice to be heard, even if you think that my voice may not be relevant at this time. So my first public lecture was Transcending Disciplines, an artist's journey to cultural sustainability, and is somehow connected to that idea of what it takes for a 21st century artist to actually be sustainable. What are the tools that you need to develop, and what are the ideas that you need to be aware of that may help you to survive as an artist in the 21st century. Going full circle from that, and I thought that that first lecture was important, at least to give the audience in the King Juan Carlos Center a broader perspective of the fact that I am the first musician, or at least I was the first musician serving as chair, but they should not be expecting like a full musical tenure. It was more like, what is the role of music in society, and how can we understand the tools and the power of music as a way of connecting the dots between the different conversations that we all have. And I use my mentor's voice all the time, and I use one of the fragments of one of the lectures that we did when we were touring together, doing his lecture tour. Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist and the humanist, usually uses the edge effect, which is the point in ecology, apparently. The edge effect is the point where two ecosystems meet, such as the forest and the savanna. And apparently, in that particular intersection is where the most new life forms are created. And Yo-Yo uses that as an example of creativity in nature, and somehow that became my go-to example of trying to use music as a way of creating that edge in between communities first, and then in between disciplines in academia. And then if you put it all together, then in between, regular human beings and academic human beings, and what are the things that we can put in place to create more meaningful connections between those two realities. So transcending disciplines, my first lecture was somehow my way of saying, I'm not the usual musician because I don't fit in, but there is so much power in the idea of not fitting in that actually led me to create my own path and let me try to prove that the role of an artist, not only in the community but also in academia and in society, is way more powerful than sometimes we think it is. Apart from the topic of invisibility, which somehow connects everything that I've done for NYU during my time there, some of the topics that I've been exploring in the past are connected to cultural memory, to diversity, and to migration. So the fall lectures, the fall 19 lectures, if we started with the Transcending Disciplines one, then I invited my colleague from the University of California in Santa Barbara, neuroscientist Kenneth Kosick, who is one of the leading scientists in Alzheimer's, but also our story started with the fact that for decades he has been working in Antioquia, in Colombia, with a group of researchers there that is led by Dr. Francisco Lopera, and they actually discovered the early onset of Alzheimer's gene through the study of a big genetical family that they could trace the origin of that family to a Spanish conquistador. And the first time we met a few years ago, we started joking with that idea, right? Like among all the things that we could be talking about, the link was the humanistic connection to the storytelling on how he tells the story of that particular part of the world, and how I tell the story, in my case, through my mother's memory loss, because she suffers from frontotemporal dementia. And since 2011, most of my musical compositions and my artist residencies at places like Harvard University or the University of California in Santa Barbara have been connected to memory loss from a cognitive level, but also from a humanistic one. If you come from a country like mine, Spain, and from a community like mine, Galicia, a historical nation, and the idea of cultural memory loss is something that is very present even today in the way we understand politics in our country. So I wanted to use that as a way of connecting the dots from a personal story of what happens to my mother when she started losing her memory. What is it that she chose to forget when she actually was fully aware? That is now very evident because she no longer has the filter of telling us her story from that particular perspective, and how much of that happens in history or in the way we understand our history. So long story short, Ken and I have been working together for over 6 years. We created a class, we put together many different projects, and I thought it would be great if he could come to the King Juan Carlos Center and talk about his work in Antioquia and in Colombia, and also his perspective as a humanist working as a neuroscientist. And it was called An Invisible Ancestry and the Unquiet Genes of the Brain. And my third lecture was Afrolatin Perspectives in Jazz and Classical Music, and that was a conversation with Afa Dworkin and Arturo Farril. And somehow that was the easiest one to put together because we are a bunch of musicians who run different projects on the side that became our passion projects. But Afa S. Dworkin is the president and one of the co-founders of the Sphinx organization, which is an organization that was born with the idea of bringing representation to classical music in the US. And their work is incredibly meaningful, and it's a work that started decades ago, and I've been collaborating with them for almost a decade now. And then Arturo Farril, who is the director or president or CEO of the Afrolatin Jazz Orchestra and the Afrolatin Jazz Alliance and another cluster of organizations here in New York City, his goal was more connected to Afro-Latin jazz and bringing visibility to that particular language or tag within the language of jazz. Somehow I didn't think that those two languages, jazz and classical music, were also so separated sometimes. And I thought it was, the conversation was very meaningful. We played some music and we improvised together. I think that was the first time the center had to bring in a piano to the auditorium, so that was kind of an event for everybody. And we had like a bagpipe and piano duo, which was probably the first in history for the center too. And it was just a beautiful conversation. And Afa from Sphinx, who actually sponsors and supports the life of many classical musicians from different, like from the Latin and Black communities. She brought in and invited one of the students from Sphinx that have created her own organization, and she also performed for us in there, and that was a beautiful moment. The last lecture of the fall 2019 was Bilingual Societies and Sustainability, Spain's Other Languages. This was a conversation, it was a roundtable, it was also a poetic recital, and it was with this idea of sustainability that I tried to open up in my first lecture of what it means for these historical nations that have their own language, like Galicia, the Basque Country, and Catalonia, what it means for editors from those particular communities to survive in the 21st century world. So we brought in Francisco Castro from Editorial Galaxia, Rosa Rey from Angla Editorial in Catalonia, Lorea Aguirre from Jackin Magazine in the Basque Country. The three of them brought a wonderful conversation on, diglossia and cultural identity through words and through the spoken words, and all of them brought poems to be read in public, and I accompanied them on the piano and on the bagpipes, and it was truly a magical moment in which all the historical nations of Spain came in together in the center of NYU to talk about what it means to survive as an editor in the 21st century. If I think about impact, we have to think about the fact that the second part of my chairship happened in the spring of 2020. And that is a moment in history that we will not forget, which is the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And when I started the semester, the spring semester of 2020, we had still one public lecture left, which was Yo-Yo Ma's visit to the center, which for me was a very meaningful and important full circle kind of moment in which I was trying not only to tell him, like, look at what you have done, like as a mentor or as a mentee, everything that I do is connected to his vision. So to be able to bring him to a place that have also changed my life, because NYU was the first institution that brought me in to a position that was not for musicians, but a position that was for something else. And the fact that they were brave enough to see the power of having an artist in that particular position somehow made me feel that if Yo-Yo came, this could be amazing. This could be like the perfect moment to bring all my worlds together and to feel grateful for what I've been given. Yo-Yo came for the last lecture, which was called Culture and Social Responsibility in the Bach Project and Beyond. First of all, I wanted him to explain and to give us some sort of context of why a person like him, an artist in the highest level of his career, embarks on an incredible project of like creating the space for social and cultural conversations all around the world, and that's the Bach Project. So we explored, or we brought up some examples of what were somehow the most meaningful moments for him or for the communities that he was working in during that time as a way of showing how culture connects us all. I've also thought that his definition of culture is something that we need today more than ever, like his way of understanding what is the role of culture in society, but what is actually culture? Like culture is everything, everybody, everything that we do is our cultural identity, it's not just the arts. So that was an important conversation to have, especially in an academic environment. And Yo-Yo and I have been playing together for a long time, and sometimes as a pianist, sometimes as a bagpiper. And I didn't want to ask Laura Turegano to bring a piano again for that event. So Yo-Yo and I performed a couple of pieces together that I think we were actually improvising in some of those, which was a beautiful way of not only saying thank you to the King Juan Carlos Center for trusting me, but also to remind me how powerful it is to have music in every event, which is what I've done also during my tenure at the King Juan Carlos Center. At that particular moment that he came in, which was March 5th of 2020, historically speaking, that's already a historical month for the Western world, and that was probably the last public event I did that year, actually. After that, the pandemic hit all of us, especially in New York, and then Spain, where I went to after that, and somehow all those questions about what is the role of the arts and the artist in the community and in society multiplied by 1,000 to all of us, because you could see, you know, how much we actually need the arts when we don't find answers to the questions that are driving our lives. And in 2020, speaking of impact, so one of the parts of this amazing position is the fact that you have to teach a class, which is my favorite part, because that is what I love doing. For me, teaching is like performing. It's even more powerful than performing, because on a stage, you go on a stage and you have the audience more or less far away from you. You create a connection, and I am able to create that connection. It's a very powerful one, but the only thing you get in return is amazing energy and amazing mostly energy that feeds you, and then you give it back to them and back to you, but there is never a conversation, right? Like, unless you then go to the front door and meet them one by one, which I usually do, but it's a different kind of connection. Teaching the classroom, it takes the same amount of energy, or even more for me, because on a stage, you have a show and then you just tour that show. But as a teacher, you have a class, and every class is different. And I enjoy teaching a lot. And I took this class as a personal challenge, not only to learn more about my own country, but also to be able to at least open up a conversation about what is the role of music in creating historical and cultural narratives on identity. And using my own instrument and my own community as an example for that, you know, Galician music, Galician language, and Galician pop, Galician rock, Galician hip-hop, Galician traditional music, all of those have always something that is connected to either a historical or a political notion of what it means to be Galicia. And that happens in the Basque Country and in Catalonia. In fact, that happens in every community in Spain, have a history of using that music as a way of embracing the beauty of difference. And so I created a class that was called Invisible Music of Northern Spain, in which we will be exploring mostly Catalan, Basque, and Galician music, but also a little bit of Sephardic music too, and all the invisible musics that are not flamenco. I wanted to give my students a way of at least finding a connection to all these other musical languages of Spain. The class was supposed to be highly collaborative. It was supposed to be ending with a public event at the King Juan Carlos Center in which my students would be creating and curating that event. All of them came from different disciplines. None of them were musicians. So the idea was that we will use these 4 qualities that Yo-Yo talks about all the time, that we practice as musicians, which is collaboration, flexibility, innovation, and creativity. We will use those 4 qualities as a way of creating an event that will help us showcase the diversity of a particular community through this public event. But yeah, the pandemic hit all of us, and after a month and a half of in-person classes that were held at the King Juan Carlos Center, we had to switch online, and we had to reframe all the goals that I had for that class. And that was a fascinating exercise in many levels, because just seeing my students creating their final individual projects, going through the process of trying to make it happen, there is nothing more powerful than finding passion in a moment in which everything else is lost. My time at the King Juan Carlos Center, because of the moment that it came for me personally, somehow gave me the confidence to believe that even if there is not a project in there, I mean, you know, because when they bring the chairs, they ask the chairs to bring their ideas with them. So that is so much generosity, you know, like the fact that they give you the space, they give you the tools, they give you everything for you to deliver a vision or to open a conversation about something else. And that doesn't happen that often. So for me to have the full responsibility of everything that I planned for the center for a full year, including the class, and that everything will have a connection and that people will be able to actually see the little things that happen in between all the conversations that we were having, I could see the transformation in the people coming to those events, or even in my students too. And it gave me the little something else that I needed to be able to say I'm ready for the next step. And even if I don't perform full-time in the next few years, it's totally okay. This is actually what I wanted to be doing for a long time. And they gave me the space and the resources to be able to do it, not only in a meaningful way, but also in a powerful way for all of us.